When I was 16 or 17, there was this boy that I was very interested in. We'll call him John. I'd like you to step back with me in time and meet him. John's a bit tall. Apparently he's here with us today. John's a bit taller than I am. He has blonde hair, but it's over this darker base. His eyes are brown and intelligent. He wears glasses. He's really cute. And even more importantly to me as a junior, he's a senior. Now, John is one of the popular seniors, and I am, well, not. I know I'm not very subtle, so I imagine John has to know that I have a huge crush on him. Now, knowing these few facts, you would think that I would remember every little detail about him asking me out on a date. I don't remember it at all, not a little. The main memory I have of John is being on a date with him, sitting in the back seat of his car, and hearing his story. I'm nervous and I'm excited. John reaches for my hand and my heart starts to quicken. But then I notice his eyes are welling up with tears. I notice I'm holding my breath, and so I try to breathe. I cock my head at him and I look at him quizzically, and he begins to speak. He tells me in this pained and halting way that he's gay. He tells me that his life changed a few summers before when he had sex with a man. This incident opened him up to a yearning he had never acknowledged to himself, let alone anybody else before. He talks about how over the last year, he's developed an enormous crush on his best friend. His hand grips mine even harder as he tells me he isn't sure that he can tell anyone else. His family, his other friends, or his best friend. He says he's not even sure why he told me. He just knows that if he doesn't talk to someone, he's going to explode. Thinking back, I remember that within seconds of him beginning, I was caught in John's story, as if I was sitting on the edge of my seat rather than leaning back into him. I remember how concerned I was about how much pain he was in. And I felt angry that this beautiful young man wasn't safe simply because he liked boys instead of girls. And it was extremely clear to me in those moments as we were talking that this was not a choice he was making, regardless of what my church of origin said or my family thought or what the culture of the 80s believed to be true. This was not a choice, because no one in their right mind would choose something that hurt this much. This was probably my first encounter with transformational listening. You know, that kind of listening that when you walk away, you're changed. It impacted me so much that it became the first in a series of fissures that developed and separated me from the church of my family. And thinking about it now, it was probably my first step towards seminary. It's not my experience that all listening is transformational listening. I mean, if we could be changed simply by hearing one another, world peace wouldn't be such an issue and racism would be a thing of the past. So what else is needed? It's my experience that in order to be transformed, I have to be somewhat vulnerable. I have to be soft and pliable. If my shoulders are threatening to push past my ears and my jaw is locked, chances are I'm not going to be changed by anything anybody else has to say. I hate watching the debates for this reason, because what I find is that I get so angry and so worked up that even if the other side has something worth hearing, I can't hear it because I'm not vulnerable. In those moments, I'm not, as the Latin definition of vulnerable would say, I'm not opened to being wounded. So how does one get vulnerable? It can be achieved in a variety of ways. I have a friend who told me that she concentrates on the physical. She makes sure that she can feel her body, her feet are on the ground, she's aware of what her limbs are doing, and she makes sure that her shoulders are relaxed. And then she breathes slowly and deeply. Others may find that vulnerability can be achieved by being present, and so they work really hard on staying in the here and the now. I, on the other hand, find that I work best through my heart. I had a therapist once that told me that I think through my heart. I think that what he meant was that when my emotions are activated, I can typically relate to the other people, even if I don't like how they act. I can relate to their pain or their happiness, or even sometimes to their anger. And being open to somebody else's anger, for me, as you might expect, given that I just told you that anger tends to shut me down, being open to anger is a true test of whether I'm available to somebody or not. When I'm vulnerable, I feel more open. I find that I'm willing to let the other in. I'm willing to let thoughts that are outside of my experience penetrate in a way that means that I consider them more fully and more carefully. I'm willing to be with people who are different than me, and I'm willing to be thoughtful and respectful in the way that I do that. I'm willing to let the other into my heart. But in order to be open and vulnerable, I find that I have to feel a certain level of safety. Now, I want to be careful with this word because I don't know about you, but safety seems to get bandied about a fair bit these days. Often I hear people talk about how they were not safe, when what I think that they're saying is that they weren't comfortable. Comfort's not what I'm talking about. I can be uncomfortable and still be open and vulnerable. I'm doing that right now. I'm nervous about talking to you. I'm nervous about showing you who I am. But I'm doing it. I'm being vulnerable with you. What I see about transformative listening is that I have to feel safe, like I'm not going to be harmed physically or mentally or spiritually. And what I know to be true for me is that if I'm not safe, I'm not going to be open to the other. And if I'm not open to the other, I'm not going to be vulnerable. And if I'm not vulnerable, I'm not going to be transformed. But in the case of John, I was. I had no worries about safety. Shoot, I was in the back seat of this man's car. I was open. Up to that point, I didn't believe that I had ever met anybody who was gay or lesbian. So John's experience of having a crush on somebody of the same sex, in some ways, was completely outside of my way of being in the world or seeing the world or feeling the world. But I did see a piece of myself in him. I related to him having this huge, mad crush on someone who was never going to see him in the same way. I had a crush on him. But the crush I had on him was not at that time, nor was it ever going to be, as heartbreaking and as painful as it was for John. John and I could have talked about my crush on him, and I would have had no fear or suspicion that I would be harmed in any way. John didn't have that luxury. It was a real threat that if he said anything to anybody, he'd be harmed. I could have talked to my friends, and even with my mom if I chose to do that. But John didn't have that luxury either. And so because there was this way in which I related so closely to his story, and yet I could see with poignancy the differences, his story had an incredible impact on me. His story helped me to build a bridge of understanding between myself and others in the queer communities that I would encounter later in my life. I think this bridge is really important. It's tied to my faith. My theology is that we are all worthy of being loved. And I also believe that we are all connected to each other in ways that surpass my ability to fully fathom. And this connection and this love, I think it's what life is really all about. I have one final story for you. In February of 1990, there were these two young men who were walking through one of Boston's rougher neighborhoods. It was around midnight. Jesse McKee was one of them. He was a music student at one of the local colleges. And he was approached by three men who told Jesse they wanted his coat. Jesse refused, and he was brutally murdered. The other young man was a man called Rigoberto Carrion. He was a laborer. He was just on his way home. He accidentally stumbled onto the scene with Jesse and the three other men. I imagine that he was confronted, and when it became apparent that he'd seen too much, they stabbed him too. But Rigoberto ran. Unfortunately, he wasn't strong enough to make it to the church he seemed to be running towards. He died. Reverend Jeffrey Brown, one of the ministers of that church, stated that even if he'd made it to the doors, it wouldn't have done him any good. There was nobody home. Reverend Jeffrey Brown is a Baptist minister who for years had been watching his neighborhood be overrun by drugs and gangs and then violence. The murder rate had escalated. He'd been creating programs to reach out to these young men, but he wasn't seeing any improvement. But this particular night, it changed Reverend Brown's way of thinking about how to reach out to these men who were wielding the knives. He and some of the other area clergy realized that they had to be in relationship with these guys. And the only way to do that was to talk with the men in the gangs. So the clergy began gathering and walking the streets from midnight to 3 a.m. The clergy soon realized that not only did they have to walk, they had to confront their own ideas about who these men were. They had been painted by society as cold and heartless. But according to Reverend Brown, these were men who were just trying to make it. After a while, they were able to start these little small conversations. Hey, preach, what's up? But those small conversations led to deeper and more complex conversations until eventually the clergy were able to facilitate conversations between these young men and some forward-thinking cops and social workers because enough trust had been established. It was then that the clergy discovered that these young men were some of the most creative and wise people they'd ever met. By investigating and mining the wisdom of this community, this collective group, those on the street and those in public service, came together and they created these programs and these support networks that effectively reduced the homicide rate in Boston by 79%. 79%. Became known as the Boston Miracle. Now, clearly, there was a risk for the clergy to be out walking in gang territory after midnight. I would guess that they walked together and they wore their clerical collars and they generally walked with a sense of purpose to increase the odds of their safety. And I would guess that even though there was a risk, that generally they felt okay. They felt safe enough. When the group decided they needed to be in relationship, I would posit that they were opening themselves up to the gang members, and that process allowed them to consider the other and be open to having a different opinion than what the general culture said about who these men were. And finally, once the groups reached a place of vulnerability with each other, they were able to discover the wisdom of the group and allow creativity to harvest the best of everybody who was at the table. For me, this is proof positive of the effect of transformational listening. It's one of the reasons that I want to devote my life to spiritual direction. Spiritual direction is a job where my role is to listen as deeply as I'm able to someone who's exploring their relationship to the divine. Or maybe somebody doesn't consider that they have a relationship with the divine. Then my role is to listen deeply to that person who's exploring how they bring their life into alignment with their highest held values. I value this story because I think it aptly describes transformational listening. But I value it for another reason too. The clergy felt compelled, presumably by their faith, to move in this direction for the betterment of their neighborhood and the world around them. That's compelling to me. I hope it's compelling to you. So this story of transformational listening begs a question for me. What or who does your philosophy of life require you to transformationally listen to? What or who does your way of thinking, your highest held values, what does that call you? Who does that call you to listen to so deeply that you'll be changed? I hope you'll ponder that in the coming week. May it be so.